we are going to look at factoring quadratic equations in the form ax squared plus bx plus c, where a is not equal to 1. So these are a little harder to factor than when a is 1. If you have a quadratic formula in this form, I tend to like to do the factoring where we look at the AC method. And so what you're doing is you're looking at the coefficient in front of x squared times your constant c. Make sure that you're carrying the signs with that. So you're looking for two numbers that multiply to give us that multiple a times c, but would add to give us that middle coefficient, which is b. So you're looking for the two numbers that multiply to AC, add to B. So I'm just going to generically, well, actually, that's not really going to help me. Then I would look for those two numbers. Let's say they were D and E. So technically, because those are the same numbers I can add to get B, I can rewrite this middle term bx using that d and the e. So I would just go ahead and rewrite this trinomial ax squared, but now I'm going to rewrite it with 4 terms instead of 3. So plus d times x plus e times x, and then plus our constant c. So if you did everything correctly, when you've done that, what you should be able to do is then go through and factor by grouping. And so what you want to do is group your first 2 terms together, and you want to group your last 2 terms together. And when we group those terms together, you're going to pull out the greatest common factor from both of those sets. And if you do it correctly there, what's inside the parentheses after pulling out the greatest common factor should be the same. So let's look at an example, because I can't really show you this without numbers in there, but let's look at an example with numbers in there. So now let's look at an example with these numbers. We have 5x squared minus 16x plus 3. So I know my a value in here is 5. My c value in here is 3. If I multiply those 2 numbers together, I get 15. So I'm looking for 2 numbers that multiply to give me 15, but they add to give me negative 16. So I notice though, when I'm multiplying 2 numbers and I'm getting a positive, but the addition of the 2 numbers are negative, that tells me that those 2 numbers I'm choosing are going to be negative numbers. So I kind of ignore the negative for a second and I think back to myself, okay, what can I multiply to get 15? But if I add those 2 numbers, I get 16. Well, that's 15 and 1. So I can rewrite those 2 sums as, or the 2 sum, negative 15 minus 1 is negative 16, and negative 15 times negative 1 is positive 15. So let's rewrite that middle term using those 2 numbers we found, rewriting our first term, 5x squared. Then we have minus 15x minus 1x. We don't usually write the 1, so I'm not going to write it. And then bringing down our constant of 3. So now if we go through and we pull out what they have in common. So I'm looking at 5x squared minus 15x. I'm looking at the coefficients 5 and negative 15. I notice that both of those have a 5 in common. And then an x squared and an x, I notice that they both have a single x in common. So I kind of think of it backwards. 5x times what would give me that first term, 5x squared, which is just x. And then 5x times what will give me back negative 15x, which would be negative 3. So looking at negative x plus 3, I noticed that really they don't have any factors in common, but I know also that I want that factor. I want this parentheses over here to be x minus 3. So I'm off by a negative sign. So really, if I factor out a negative 1 from both of those terms, I would have what's the same thing in that parentheses. This time, I'm just going to write the 1 there just because it's helpful to see when we start now pulling out what they have in common. And now what they have in common is this parentheses, x minus 3. So if I pull out x minus 3 times from 5x times x minus 3, I'm just left with a 5x for that first grouping. And if I pull out the x minus 3 from that second grouping, I'm left with a negative 1. And so we can always check this by going backwards and doing our distributive method and show that we get back 5x squared minus 16x plus 3. So let's look at another example of factoring where that coefficient in front of x squared is not 1. We have 3x squared minus 16x minus 64. So I'm looking at this and I'm getting a little scared because of those huge numbers, but we can do this. So let's look at our a value, which is 3, times our c value, which is negative 64. So again, make sure that you're pulling out that sign that's with that number. And so I need to look at what is 3 times negative 64. So positive times a negative I know is negative. And 3 times 4 is 12. I carry my 1. 3 times 6 is 18 plus that 1 is 19. So 3 times negative 64 is negative 192. So I'm trying to find two numbers that multiply to give me negative 192, but it's going to add to give me this coefficient of negative 16, my b value. So again, I'm kind of a little bit freaking out because 192, I don't really know factors of 192 that would multiply to 192 and add to 16. Negative 192, negative 16. But if that's the case, then what you should kind of do is start using your factoring tree, trying to rewrite your number as prime factors. And then we can start grouping numbers together to try to help us. So I'm looking at 192 and I'm trying to bring this down to prime numbers. And so first thing I would look at is, well, that's an even number, so I know that 2 has to go in there. And so let's divide 192 by 2, which is a prime number. Prime numbers are where only 1 in itself are factors of the number. So 2 goes in there. I see 96 times. Well, if I looked at those two factors, I noticed that those are not going to add to negative 16 if one was positive, one negative. So I'm going to continue to go down and I'm going to break down 96. Well, again, I see that that's even, so I can pull out a 2. And I also see that that is divisible by 3. So it doesn't matter which two factors you choose as long as it's not 1 in itself. And so let's just pull out a 2 since I was doing that anyways before. So pulling out a 2, 2 goes into 9 4 times with a remainder of 1. So 2 goes into 16 8 times. Okay, so now I'm kind of thinking again about grouping. 2 times 2 is 4. Well, would 4 and a 48, if one's positive, one's negative, would that add to a negative 16? And it doesn't. So break it down again. I notice that 48 has 4 in common. 4 goes into it, so that would go in 12 times. Actually, I shouldn't circle that because it's really not prime, but I'm just going to kind of think about the multiples here. 2 times 2 times 4. Well, 2 times 2 is 16, 16. I'm not sorry. 2 times 2 is 4, and 4 times 4 is 16. Getting ahead of myself. 16. Ooh, this looks good. 16. And this 12 right here. Well, if one of those is oh. Actually, that doesn't work. 16 and 12 doesn't look like it works. I was getting so excited over nothing. That's not going to add to a negative 16 if one was positive, one was negative. So let me try and maybe a little bit of a different grouping of these right here. Let's see if I multiplied, kind of tedious. So this is where I might go in and use quadratic formula if I had to factor, but it's good just to see the process of this. So if I thought about another way to do these groupings of the numbers that I have here, I have a 2 times a 4. So that would give me 8. And if I group the other last two numbers, 2 times 12, that is 24. Okay, we got it. 24 minus 8 is 16. I want the larger number to have the negative. And the bigger number is going to be positive, because if I add a positive and a negative, I'm actually using subtraction. I ignore the sign, looking at the larger number without the sign. 24 minus 8 is 16, and I carry my sign in front, which is negative, so negative 16. So that works. And so those two numbers we just found were negative 24 and positive 8. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to rewrite the middle term with those two numbers. It doesn't matter the order that you put those two numbers, at the end we'll get the same thing. So I'm going to just rewrite it how I had written it over there. So negative 24x plus an 8x minus a 64. So now we're going to group the first two terms. We're going to group the last two terms. I'm looking at 3x squared and negative 24x, and I'm looking at what they have in common. And I notice they both have a 3 and they both have an x in common. So if I factor a 3 and an x out of 3x squared, I'd be left with a single x. I know 3 times negative 8 is negative 24, so it would be x minus 8. So I want x minus 8 in the parentheses over here. And looking at what they both have in common, I noticed that they both have an 8 in common. And if I put an 8 here and distribute, I would get back that 8x minus 64. So we're almost there. What we have in the parentheses is the same. If we pull that out of both of these groupings, pulling out x minus 8 from the first piece, you're left with 3x. And pulling out x minus 8 from that second piece, you're left with plus 8. So we factored this, and if we went back and distributed, we could see that we would get back 3x squared minus 16x minus 64.